In court, my ex-husband straightened his expensive suit and looked the judge in the eye. Calm, confident, polished. "She's unstable, Your Honor," he said, asking for full custody like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. The judge nodded slowly, clearly buying every word. I tried to speak, but my chest locked up. The air felt too heavy to breathe. And then my 7-year-old daughter stood up beside me. She wasn't holding my hand. She was holding her scratched purple game console. "I have a video," she said quietly. "I think you need to see who my daddy really is. To understand why the courtroom felt so hopeless that morning, you have to understand the man standing across from me." My ex-husband wasn't just Christian anymore. Not in this city. He was Councilman Christian Vance. In Savannah, that name carried weight. He was the man who cut ribbons at new libraries and stood smiling in photos beside school principals and charity organizers. The man who shook hands with retirees at community events and somehow made every person feel like they mattered. His smile was practiced, but warm, his voice steady and reassuring. The kind of voice people trusted without even thinking about it. He had perfected the image. The tailored suits, the calm posture, the way he listened carefully before speaking, like every word coming out of someone else's mouth deserved respect. When he entered a room, people straightened their backs a little. When he spoke, they leaned forward. And in that courtroom, that same performance was unfolding. He stood there in a suit that probably cost more than my rent for several months. Combined shoulders, relaxed hands folded neatly on the table. Not angry, not aggressive, just concerned. Concerned for his daughter, concerned for her safety, concerned about her unstable mother. There's actually a psychological term for what was happening in that moment. Psychologists call it the halo effect. It's a strange little trick our brains play on us. When someone looks successful, confident, and attractive, we automatically assume they're also honest, responsible, even morally good. We see the suit, the posture, the polished smile, and our minds fill in the rest. Leader, protector, good father. Christian didn't just benefit from that effect. He built his entire life around it. He knew exactly what people saw when they looked at him, and he used it like armor. Because when the courtroom looked at him, they didn't see the man I knew. They saw a public servant trying to protect his child. Then they looked at me, and the contrast couldn't have been worse. I wasn't polished. I wasn't confident. I didn't have a staff helping manage my image or a career built on shaking hands and smiling for cameras. I was just tired. I work as a medical transcriptionist. My days are spent listening to doctors dictate diagnoses and surgical notes, typing them out, word by word, while wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones. It's quiet work, invisible work. You sit alone for hours, listening to people talk about cancer, heart failure, and terminal illnesses. Over time, that kind of job settles into your bones. It leaves shadows under your eyes. And that morning in court, those shadows were visible. My hands trembled slightly on the table. My shoulders were tense. I hadn't slept properly in days. Anyone looking at me would see exactly what Christian wanted them to see. A nervous woman, an overwhelmed mother, maybe even someone unstable. The judge glanced between us. On one side, a respected councilman in a perfect suit. On the other, a quiet woman with shaking hands and dark circles under her eyes. Before I even opened my mouth, the story had already begun forming in everyone's minds. Christian, the responsible father. Me, The problem, I could see it in the way the judge nodded while he spoke, in the way the courtroom staff watched him with polite interest. Even the stenographer seemed slightly charmed by him smiling politely when he gave her a courteous nod. Meanwhile, I sat there feeling like the only person in the room who smelled smoke. Like everyone else was admiring the beautiful house, while I knew the walls were filled with gas. That's the real power of the halo effect. It doesn't just make someone look good. It makes the truth sound unbelievable when it finally shows up. From the outside, our marriage looked quiet, almost boring. There were no screaming matches spilling into the street, no broken dishes, no bruises hidden under long sleeves. If you had visited our house back then, you probably would have left thinking we were normal. That's the tricky thing about certain kinds of abuse. It doesn't look like violence. Christian's version was quieter, cleaner, harder to explain to people who had never lived inside it. He didn't yell. He erased. At first, it was small things. The kind of moments you brush off because they seem too petty to matter. I would tell a story about something that happened earlier in the week, and he would tilt his head slightly and say, "That's not how it happened." Not angrily, not accusingly, just calmly, confidently, like he was correcting a simple mistake. And because he sounded so certain, I would hesitate. Maybe I remembered it wrong. Maybe I misunderstood the situation. It happened again a few days later, then again the week after that. Slowly, the ground under my memories started to shift. If I said he promised to pick up groceries, he would smile faintly and say he never said that. If I mentioned a conversation we had, he would insist we talked about something completely different. And the strange thing was, he never pushed too hard, just enough to make me doubt myself. It's a strange experience realizing you no longer trust your own thoughts. Imagine trying to walk across a floor that keeps quietly rearranging itself under your feet. Eventually, you stop walking with confidence. You start stepping carefully, apologetically. Christian loved that version of me, the one who second-guessed everything she said. Sometimes I would start telling a story at dinner and he would just look at me, not interrupt, not argue, just look. A long, patient stare that somehow made my voice fade away in the middle of a sentence. By the time I stopped talking, I felt embarrassed, even though I couldn't explain why. That was his talent. He could make you feel foolish without ever raising his voice. Over time, I stopped sharing opinions altogether. It felt safer to stay quiet than to risk being corrected, laughed at, or gently clarified. People think abuse has to be loud, but sometimes it's just the slow dismantling of someone's confidence, piece by piece, year by year. By the end of our marriage, I had started to believe the story he'd been quietly writing about me all along, that I was forgetful, overly emotional, unstable. And that belief is powerful, because when someone convinces you that your mind can't be trusted, you stop defending yourself. You stop arguing. You stop fighting back. Which made the custody battle even more terrifying, because Christian wasn't asking for Sophia out of love. Anyone who lived with him long enough could see that. Fatherhood annoyed him. The noise of toys scattered across the floor irritated him. The way Sophia asked endless questions made his jaw tighten. He didn't like mess. He didn't like unpredictability. And children by nature are both. What he loved was control, and in his mind, custody wasn't about raising a daughter. It was about removing a problem. As long as Sophia lived with me, I still had something anchoring me to the world. A reason to speak up. A reason to exist loudly enough that he couldn't completely erase me. Taking her away would solve that. If Sophia disappeared from my life, so would my voice. No more school meetings. No more shared decisions. No more reason for anyone to listen to me when I said the man they admired wasn't who they thought he was. That's what made the whole thing so chilling. To the courtroom, Christian looked like a devoted father fighting for his child. But to me, it felt like watching a businessman finalizing a hostile takeover. And I was the company he planned to shut down once the assets were gone. If Christian's world was bright and polished, ours lived in the shadows. Sophia and I called our place the Fortress. It was really just a converted attic in an old Victorian house on the edge of Savannah's historic district. The landlord had tried to make it feel charming, white paint on the beams, a tiny skylight, a narrow staircase that creaked every time you climbed it. But the truth was, the place was barely held together by age and stubbornness. The floors slanted slightly, just enough that if you rolled a marble, it would slowly drift toward the wall. The radiator hissed and clanked all winter like an irritated cat that refused to sleep. And when it rained, which in Savannah it often does, the sound on the roof was deafening. The drops hammered against the shingles so loudly it felt like the whole sky had decided to sit right on top of our heads. Most people would have hated it. Christian certainly did. The one time he saw the place after we separated, he looked around with open disgust and called it a rat's nest. But to us, it wasn't a rat's nest. It was a bunker. It was the one place in the city he refused to come back to. That alone made it feel safe. During the day, while Sophia was home from school or sitting quietly nearby, I worked at a small desk wedged beneath the slanted ceiling. My world existed almost entirely inside a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones. I'm a medical transcriptionist. That means doctors record their notes after appointments or surgeries, and people like me listen to those recordings and type them out word for word. Diagnoses, treatment plans, surgical reports. Some days it's routine. Other days, it's the worst news a human being can receive. Cancer staging, terminal prognosis, emergency surgeries that didn't go the way anyone hoped. You spend enough years doing that job, you start noticing things other people miss. Not just the words, but the spaces around them. The hesitation before a doctor says terminal. The breath someone takes before admitting a treatment failed. You learn that the truth in a conversation rarely lives in the loud parts. It lives in the pauses, in the static. Sophia understood that instinctively. She was never the loud kind of child. She didn't run around the apartment banging toys together or demanding attention the way other 7-year-olds sometimes do. Most afternoons, she would curl up in the corner of the fortress on a faded beanbag chair. Legs tucked under her, completely absorbed in her little purple handheld game console. The thing looked like it had survived a small war. The plastic casing was scratched and chipped on one corner where she dropped it on the sidewalk. The screen had smudges and fingerprints that never quite came clean. I'd bought it at a pawn shop for $40 after noticing how fascinated she was with electronics. And from the moment she got it, it rarely left her hands. She took it everywhere. The grocery store, the park, even the bathroom. Christian hated it. He used to complain that it made her look disconnected from the world. Like she was checked out hiding behind a screen while life moved around her. But he misunderstood something important. Sophia wasn't checking out. She was tuning in. The console gave her a kind of quiet shield. When she held it, people stopped expecting her to talk constantly. They stopped asking questions or pushing her to perform like other kids. That space let her observe, watch, listen. She would sit there, fingers moving over the buttons. eyes drifting occasionally toward whatever conversation was happening nearby. And sometimes I would notice something strange. She heard things, not just words, but tone. The shift in someone's voice, the way a sentence changed meaning halfway through. The same kind of listening my job had trained me to do. Back then, I thought the purple console was just a comfort object for a quiet kid. A little digital escape she carried everywhere. I didn't realize it was something else. A shield, a tool. And as that courtroom was about to discover, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one paying the closest attention to everything. By the time that courtroom hearing began, something inside me had already gone quiet. My lawyer kept nudging my arm under the table, whispering that I should object, that I should speak up, that I needed to challenge what Christian was saying. From his perspective, my silence probably looked like surrender. From the outside, it probably looked like weakness. But what people don't understand is that silence can be learned. There's a psychological term for it, learned helplessness. It comes from experiments where animals were placed in situations where they couldn't escape discomfort or punishment, no matter how hard they tried. Eventually, they stopped trying. Even when the door was finally opened, they stayed still. Not because they were incapable of leaving, but because they had been trained to believe escape was impossible. That's what years with Christian had done to me. He never needed to scream or throw things. His punishments were always strategic. If I challenged him during an argument the next day, I would open our banking app and find our joint account nearly empty. He had moved the money somewhere I couldn't reach. When I confronted him, he would shrug and say he was just being responsible with finances. If I cried or tried to explain how much his behavior hurt me, he would disappear. 3 days, sometimes 4. No calls, no texts, no explanation, just silence. Those were the worst days, because silence makes you question everything. Was it my fault? Did I push too hard? Did I say something wrong? By the time he came back, I would already be apologizing. Eventually, my brain started doing the math automatically. Fighting back meant consequences. Speaking up meant punishment, so I adapted. People sometimes imagine survival as something dramatic, standing up, shouting, escaping. But sometimes survival looks like doing the opposite. Sometimes it looks like going still. There's an old survival trick animals use called playing possum. When a possum feels trapped by a predator, it can't fight, it collapses into stillness. Heart rate slows, breathing becomes shallow. It stops moving entirely. The predator sometimes loses interest. That's how I survived my marriage, by becoming very, very still. In the courtroom that day, that same instinct took over before I even realized it. My body reacted the way it had been trained to react for years. Christian spoke calmly to the judge, describing me as unstable. My lawyer whispered for me to respond, but my chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped invisible wire around my ribs. My throat refused to cooperate. Every time I tried to push words out, they dissolved before reaching my mouth. It wasn't just fear, it was conditioning. My mind had learned that speaking only made things worse. Christian stood there confident and composed, knowing exactly how to perform for the room. And somewhere deep inside, the old version of me, the one who had survived years of psychological traps, was whispering the same advice it always had. Don't move. Don't provoke him. Stay small and maybe he'll lose interest. So I sat there, gripping the edge of the table, my knuckles turning pale, feeling like I was watching the destruction of my life from underwater. The possum was playing dead. What I didn't realize, though, was that someone else in that courtroom had been watching the entire time. Someone who hadn't learned that lesson yet. While I was frozen trying to survive the only way I knew how my daughter had been learning something very different. She hadn't been playing dead. She had been paying attention. The weeks leading up to the final hearing didn't feel like a custody dispute. They felt like a siege. A normal legal fight implies two sides pushing against each other, both trying to win. But Christian wasn't interested in a fair fight. He wanted something much more final than that. He wanted to make sure there was nothing left of me by the time we walked into that courtroom. It started quietly, the way most of his moves did. One afternoon, I opened my email between transcription files and saw a message from his lawyer. Not from Christian himself, he was always careful about that. He understood the value of distance, of never leaving his own fingerprints on the uglier parts of the process. The subject line sounded harmless enough. Proposed educational plan regarding minor child Sophia Vance. For a second, I actually believed it might be something reasonable. Maybe a school schedule discussion, maybe a tutoring program. Then I opened the attachment. It was a glossy brochure for a place called St. Jude's Academy for Girls. The photos were exactly what you'd expect from an expensive boarding school advertisement. Perfect lawns. Girls in neat uniforms walking between ivy-covered buildings. Smiling teachers guiding small classroom discussions. It looked peaceful, orderly, and it was located 3 states away. The email explained in polished legal language that Christian believed Sophia's current living environment was not conducive to healthy development, that the instability of her home life could limit her potential, that a structured residential academy would give her the discipline and opportunities she deserved. 300 miles away from me. At first I thought I misunderstood something. I reread the message twice, then 3 times. But the meaning didn't change. Christian wasn't asking for custody so he could raise his daughter. He was asking for custody so he could send her away. He didn't want to pack lunches or drive her to school or sit through parent-teacher conferences. He just wanted the legal authority to put her somewhere I couldn't reach her. It felt like someone had taken my heart and mailed it to another zip code. But that wasn't the only move he made. A few days later, another document arrived. This one was heavier. Christian was suing me for $60,000 in legal fees. The claim argued that my refusal to cooperate with his custody proposal had caused unnecessary legal expenses, that my frivolous defense and documented instability forced him to spend excessive money protecting his daughter's best interests. $60,000. I remember staring at the number on the page for a long time, doing the quiet math in my head. I worked freelance contracts as a medical transcriptionist. Some months were steady, other months were frighteningly thin. I tracked groceries down to the cent. I knew exactly how much heating oil we could afford each winter. $60,000 wasn't a legal fee to me. It was financial extinction. Christian knew that. To him, $60,000 was the price of a golf membership, a charity donation, a networking expense. But for me, it was a crushing weight designed to push me to the ground. The message behind it was simple. Fight me and I will ruin you. It wasn't really about winning custody. Custody was just the tool. What Christian wanted was control. The same control he had exercised throughout our marriage, just now wrapped in legal paperwork and delivered through expensive attorneys. If he took Sophia and buried me under debt at the same time, I wouldn't have the strength or the resources to challenge him ever again. That was the strategy. Not victory, erasure. And every night in the fortress, after Sophia had fallen asleep with her purple console beside her, I would sit at the small desk under the slanted ceiling and stare at the numbers on my laptop. Legal bills, rent, utilities, food. I tried to imagine a future where my daughter woke up hundreds of miles away in a dormitory bed surrounded by strangers with no way to come home. The thought made the room feel smaller, louder, like the rain on the roof was closing in. I wasn't just afraid of losing a court case. I was afraid of losing everything at the same time. My child, my stability, my voice. And the worst part was knowing that Christian understood exactly how terrified I was, because fear was the one language he had always spoken fluently. The most frightening moment before the final hearing didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened in the hallway. Court had paused for a short recess while the lawyers argued over motions. People drifted in and out of the corridor, clerks carrying folders, attorneys murmuring into phones, the low hum of courthouse life continuing like it always does. I was standing near a water fountain trying to steady my hands. That was when I smelled it. Sandalwood and peppermint. Christian. For a second, I didn't even need to turn around. My body recognized him before my eyes did. The scent alone was enough to tighten every muscle in my shoulders. He stepped beside me close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but not so close that anyone passing by would think something was wrong. That was always his style. Never obvious, never messy, just subtle enough to stay invisible. He pretended to glance at his watch like a neighbor making small talk in line at the grocery store. "You look tired, Brianna," he said softly. His voice had that same smooth calm the judge found so reassuring. The same tone he used during public speeches and charity events. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" I kept my eyes forward. The marble floor, the reflection of fluorescent lights, anything but his face. "We both know how this ends," he continued. His words weren't angry. They were almost gentle, like he was offering helpful advice. "You can't afford to fight me." The sentence hung in the air between us. "And let's be honest," he added, glancing briefly at the jacket I'd borrowed for court. "You can't even afford that suit." I said nothing. Silence had always been my safest move around him. "Take the deal," he said, lowering his voice, just enough that only I could hear it. "Let Sophia go to the school. It's a good place. Structure, discipline, opportunity. 3 states away. You let her go," he continued calmly, "and I'll drop the legal fees. 60,000 disappears. Just like that." He snapped his fingers softly. "You can go back to your attic, put on your little headphones, pretend none of this ever happened." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned a little closer, his breath warm near my ear. "But if you walk back into that courtroom tomorrow," he whispered, "I will bury you." There was no anger in his voice, just certainty. "You're already erased, Brianna," he said quietly. "You just haven't realized it yet." Then he stepped away. Just like that. One moment he was beside me, the next he was greeting a passing clerk with a warm smile, nodding politely like the friendly councilman everyone adored. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor as he walked away down the hallway. For a long time I stood there staring at the water fountain. He thought he had broken me. He thought the fear would make me fold the way it always had before. But something about the way he said Sophia's name, something about the casual way he talked about shipping her away like a package, shifted something deep inside my chest. Christian believed he was speaking to the same woman he had controlled for years. The woman who played possum. What he didn't understand was this. When you corner a mother and threaten her child, the instinct to stay still doesn't survive very long. Something else wakes up instead. By the time the hearing resumed, the mood in the courtroom had changed. The tension that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something heavier. Something closer to inevitability. Christian's lawyer stood confidently at the front of the courtroom, delivering his closing argument with the calm rhythm of someone who already believed the outcome was decided. He spoke about Sophia's future, about opportunity, stability, structure. Every word sounded polished and reasonable. He described the boarding school like it was a gift, a place where Sophia could flourish far away from what he carefully called her mother's chaotic influence. The judge listened with the tired patience of someone who had heard hundreds of custody disputes before. She occasionally jotted something down, nodding slightly as the lawyer spoke. Across the room, Christian sat perfectly still beside his attorney, confident, composed. He looked like a man who had already won. I sat at the defense table, gripping the edge so tightly my fingers had gone numb. My lawyer leaned toward me once or twice, whispering suggestions. Object, clarify something. Say something before the judge rules. But the same invisible weight pressed down on my chest. The old conditioning, the instinct to stay quiet. The possum was still playing dead. When Christian's lawyer finally finished, the room fell silent. He gathered his papers neatly and returned to his seat with the satisfied posture of someone who had just completed a clean, convincing performance. Judge Harmon removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose for a moment. Then she looked directly at me. "Miss Vance," she said, using Christian's last name like the court records required. It stung every time. "Do you have any final evidence to present before I make my ruling regarding temporary custody?" My lawyer shifted in his chair, preparing to stand. I could almost hear the words he planned to say, something about requesting more time, maybe arguing about the financial pressure from the legal fees. But before he could speak, another sound cut through the silence. A zipper. Loud, sharp, completely out of place in the quiet courtroom. Everyone turned. I did too. Sophia was standing up from the bench behind me. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking straight at Christian, and in her hands, she held the purple game console. Up close in that formal room of dark wood and leather chairs, it looked almost ridiculous. The casing was scratched, the corner chipped from. When she dropped it weeks earlier, the screen smudged with fingerprints. It looked like exactly what it was, a toy. Christian saw it and let out a short, amused laugh. Not nervous, dismissive. He turned slightly toward the judge with the weary expression of someone dealing with a poorly behaved child. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, gesturing toward Sophia. "This is exactly what I mean. She brings that thing everywhere. She's addicted to it because her mother uses it as a babysitter." Then he shifted his gaze to Sophia. His councilman voice returned, the one designed to make people obey without question. "Sophia," he said firmly, "put that away. Adults are talking." For years that voice had been enough to silence an entire room. But Sophia didn't sit down. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, walking past me and the defense table, past Christian in his perfectly tailored suit, until she reached the courtroom railing where the bailiff stood. She held up the console. "I need to plug this in," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "It has an audio jack, like headphones." The bailiff hesitated, glancing toward the judge for guidance. Across the room, Christian sighed dramatically. "Your Honor, please," he said, shaking his head. "She's just trying to play a game. This is a waste of the court's time." Judge Harmon studied Sophia for a moment. Maybe she noticed the determined set of her jaw. Maybe she just wanted to see what the interruption was about. Either way, after a few quiet seconds, she gave a small nod. "Let her plug it in." The bailiff took the purple console carefully, like he wasn't quite sure what to make of it. He turned it over in his hands, found the small headphone jack on the side, and connected an auxiliary cable that ran into the courtroom's audio system. A faint pop echoed through the speakers mounted along the walls. Sophia stood on her tiptoes beside him. Then she reached out and pressed the play button. For a moment, nothing happened, just static. The low hum of the courtroom ventilation system, the quiet shuffle of someone adjusting papers, a few seconds of awkward silence stretching across the room. Across the aisle, Christian glanced at his watch with open impatience. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something under his breath. They both looked relaxed, like they were waiting for a child's little distraction to end. Then the courtroom screen flickered to life. The image was shaky at first, tilted slightly to the side as if the camera had been set down in a hurry. The angle was low, pointing upward from somewhere near a shelf or a counter. It took a second for my brain to recognize the room. Christian's bathroom. The same polished marble counters. The tall mirror framed by soft lights. Everything neat and expensive and carefully arranged. And standing in front of that mirror was Christian. He was wearing the same suit he had on in the courtroom now, except his tie hung loose around his neck. He leaned forward toward his reflection, studying himself with intense focus. Then he spoke. "She is unstable, Your Honor." The exact words he had used in court earlier. But this version sounded different, flat. He frowned at his own reflection and shook his head. No, too aggressive," he muttered. He straightened his posture slightly, rolling his shoulders back, adjusting his expression. "Make them feel sorry for you," he said quietly to himself. Then he tried again. "She is unstable, Your Honor." This time his voice softened. His shoulders sagged just a little, like a man weighed down by concern. "She projects her trauma onto our daughter." He continued, his voice cracking at just the right moment. "I only want to protect Sophia." The performance was perfect. He held the expression for a beat longer, studying himself in the mirror. Then the mask dropped. A slow grin spread across his face. "Nailed it," he said. The courtroom air seemed to thin all at once. I could hear someone in the gallery inhale sharply. On the screen, Christian reached for his phone just as it began to ring on the bathroom counter. He tapped the speaker button and set it down beside the sink while adjusting his tie. A voice crackled through the recording. "Did you get the email about the boarding school?" It was his lawyer. The same man now sitting stiffly beside him at the plaintiff's table. Christian chuckled. "Yeah, I got it. St. Jude sounds miserable," he said lightly. "Perfect." The lawyer's voice hesitated. "Are you sure about this Christian sending her 3 states away? The judge might think that's extreme. You're asking for full custody just to ship her off." Christian leaned closer to the mirror, inspecting his teeth. From that low camera angle, the expression on his face looked cold, completely empty. "I don't care about the kid, Mike." The words echoed through the courtroom speakers. For a second, nobody moved. On the screen, Christian shrugged casually. "I don't want to raise her," he continued. "I just want to break Brianna. Taking the kid is the only way to do it." The silence in the courtroom became suffocating. When she's gone, he added, straightening his tie, Brianna falls apart and I win. That's the game. A short laugh followed. Cruel. Hollow? And hey, he said with a smirk. Boarding school means I don't have to deal with her little toys or that creepy staring she does. The video ended with a quiet click. The screen went black. For several long seconds, no one in the courtroom spoke. The only sound left was the low hum of the ventilation system, and the slow, horrifying realization spreading across the room that the man everyone had just trusted had been rehearsing the entire lie. For a few seconds after the screen went black, the courtroom didn't move. No one shuffled papers. No one whispered. It was the kind of silence that only happens when reality cracks open and everyone hears it at the same time. Then Christian's chair scraped violently against the floor. "That's fake," he shouted, his voice suddenly thin and sharp. "That's a deep fake. AI can do that now." She manipulated it. The calm, polished councilman voice was gone. In its place was something frantic. His hands shook as he pointed toward the screen, then toward Sophia, then toward me, like he was trying to grab hold of any explanation that might still work. But no one in the room looked convinced anymore. The stenographer had stopped typing. The bailiff's posture had stiffened eyes locked on Christian with open suspicion. Even his own lawyer looked like he wished he could melt into the chair beside him. The halo effect, the invisible glow that had surrounded Christian all morning, didn't fade slowly. It vanished. And in its place, people saw something else. Judge Harmon slowly removed her glasses. She didn't look tired anymore. She looked furious. Her eyes stayed fixed on Christian's face, studying him like she was seeing him for the first time. Not the polished councilman, not the respectable father. Something colder, something calculating. The disgust in her expression was unmistakable. It was the look of someone realizing they had almost handed a child directly to the very person they were supposed to protect her from. Across the room, Sophia stood quietly beside the railing, the purple console still in her hands. Small, still, but suddenly the most powerful person in the room. The balance of power had flipped so completely it almost made the air feel different to breathe. Judge Harmon didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that when she finally spoke, every word seemed to land with a heavy, deliberate weight. "Mr. Vance," she said slowly. Christian stopped talking mid-sentence. His protests about deepfakes and manipulation hung awkwardly in the air as he turned toward the bench. The judge leaned forward slightly, her hands folded together. "In 20 years on this bench," she continued, "I have seen parents fight for their children out of love. I have seen them fight out of fear. I have even seen them fight out of anger." Her eyes never left his face. "But I have never," she said carefully, "seen a parent treat a custody hearing like a theatrical audition." The words landed like a hammer. Christian swallowed. The confidence that had filled him earlier was completely gone now. "Your Honor, I was just preparing," he said quickly, trying to recover the smooth tone he'd used all morning. "It's a stressful situation. People vent." "You were rehearsing," Judge Harmon cut in sharply. The words snapped through the room. "You were coaching yourself on how to manipulate this court into believing a performance. A performance designed to separate a child from the one parent who actually wants her." Christian opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The judge turned slightly toward the stenographer. Strike the plaintiff's previous testimony from the record, she said firmly. The court finds that testimony to be inconsistent with the video evidence presented. The quiet clicking of keys resumed as the stenographer began typing again. Then Judge Harmon looked back at Christian and let the record show she continued that based on the recording submitted by the minor child, this court finds Mr. Vance's petition for full custody to be not only meritless, but malicious. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Christian stood frozen at the plaintiff's table. I am denying your request for custody, the judge said. She paused. Then her voice dropped lower. Effective. Immediately. This court is stripping you of all custodial rights regarding Sophia Vance. The words echoed in the room like a final verdict. Christian's face drained of color. Judge Harmon wasn't finished. I am also referring this recording to the district attorney's office for review regarding potential fraud and perjury charges. A quiet gasp came from somewhere behind me. And Mr. Vance, she added, her gaze hard as stone. If you attempt to contact Miss Vance or her daughter again, outside of appropriate legal channels, this court will take immediate action to ensure you spend your time in a cell rather than a counsel's seat. Another long silence settled over the room. Then the judge leaned back slightly. You may leave my courtroom. Christian didn't argue this time. He simply stood there for a moment, staring down at the table like he was trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. The expensive suit still hung perfectly on his shoulders, but now it looked different. Not powerful, just expensive. A costume that no longer worked. He grabbed his briefcase without looking at anyone. Not the judge, not his lawyer, not me, and not Sophia. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom. The sharp click of his leather shoes against the floor followed him all the way to the door. But this time, it didn't sound like authority. It sounded like retreat. Rain traced the courthouse steps as Sophia and I slipped into a small ice cream shop. Between us sat the purple game console that had quietly captured the truth. I finally understood Sophia hadn't been escaping into games. She'd been listening. Children who grow quiet often hear everything. Sometimes the smallest witnesses carry the clearest truth. If stories like this matter to you, please like, share, and subscribe so more voices like Sophia's are heard.